Madam President, this is the first time that I've done this. Well, you've been presiding, but over the last 2 years since the mass tragedy in my state at Sandy Hook, Connecticut, I've come down to the floor once every week or so to give voice to the victims of gun violence all across this country. I've told the story of the beautiful 6- and 7-year-olds, as well as their teachers and professionals who were killed that day. But the fact is that every day across this country, there are 2 to 3 Sandy Hooks that happen, and that there are 86 people killed by guns every day in this country, 2,600 a month, and over 30,000 a year. And the statistics, unfortunately, have not compelled this body to action. We've done nothing. Zero about this national tragedy since Sandy Hook, and that's a stain upon the conscience of this body that is impossible to erase. So my hope is that by coming down to the floor and talking about who these people actually are, maybe it will prompt us to have a conversation about how we can make sure that these numbers aren't eliminated, they're never going to go away, but that they're lower, that they're less than these numbers, the highest in the developed world. So let me talk first about an extraordinary man, young man, 44 years old, who was killed on January 20th, just about 2 weeks ago, a few weeks ago in Boston, Massachusetts. His name was Dr. Michael Davidson, and he was shot by a gunman who walked into Brigham and Women's Hospital. This was the relative of someone who had been under the care of Dr. Davidson, clearly had some major illness that prompted him to think that he could solve his grief by shooting the doctor who had cared for his loved one. Dr. Davidson was known at Brigham and Women's Hospital for his gentle way with patients and their families, his willingness to operate on the most delicate hearts. He used to lie awake at night worrying about his patients, and he was always receiving letters about the great care that he provided. He wanted to be a cardiovascular surgeon from the time that he was a little boy, which is a pretty exceptional thing. And as renowned as he was as a physician, what he really will be remembered for is being a father to 3 children, who was waiting for his 4th to arrive, due this April. At his funeral, nearly 1,000 people were there to hear his wife say, "By now you've all heard that my husband, Michael Davidson, was a superb physician. Perhaps most importantly, he cared immensely for his patients and their families. That's why the fact that a patient's family member would take Michael away from us makes it all the more devastating. A brilliant surgeon, a wonderful father, taken away from us at age 44 in Boston, Massachusetts." Everyone by now has heard the story from December 20th, where 2 New York City police officers were killed by a mentally ill man who drove to New York with the intention of killing police officers. Wei-Jin Liu had been in this country almost 20 years to the day, an American dream story personified. His family came to this country from China to seek a better life. He came here on Christmas Eve, 1994. He wanted to be a police officer because he wanted to give back to his community. Liu once said that, "I know that being a cop is dangerous, but I must do it. If I don't do it and you don't do it, then who's going to do it?" That kind of commitment was shown by the very fact that he was in the car that day. He wasn't scheduled to work, but he volunteered to work a fill-in shift when a fellow officer was late. That's just how he was. Rafael Ramos, otherwise known as Ralph Ramos, was in that car as well. He wanted to be a police officer so bad that when he was preparing to join the police academy, he took a petition door to door throughout his whole neighborhood, asking for his neighbors to testify to his character. He's remembered as a good police officer, but also somebody who just shoveled all the sidewalks in his neighborhood, took his 2 boys to a nearby park over and over to play basketball, always with a smile on his face. He was hours away of becoming a lay chaplain. It was one of his dreams, was to go into the ministry. He's remembered by friends and family as someone committed to his family, committed to his job, but also committed to his faith. These two police officers, Madam President, were killed by a man named Ismail Brinsley. This was a deeply mentally ill man, someone who had tried to commit suicide, who had become completely isolated from his family and from his peers. And when I read his story, it struck me as not completely dissimilar from the story in Newtown, Connecticut, the story of Adam Lanza. Adam Lanza was a deeply troubled, deeply mentally ill young man who eventually became isolated from his peers and from his family. Now, we can't completely understand what caused him to do what he did that day, nor what Mr. Brinsley was thinking in his head when he drove to New York to carry out those heinous murders. But what we know is that we have largely abandoned the mentally ill in this country. We lock them up in prisons rather than treating their underlying illnesses. Over the course of the last half a decade, 4,000 inpatient psychiatric beds have been closed all across this country, forcing more of the mentally ill out onto the streets, into the prisons, and into crisis. You know that the federal law authorizing the funding we send to mental health work in this country, SAMHSA, that's the agency, that law hasn't been reauthorized in a decade. We haven't even debated mental health policy on the floor of this Senate for a decade. No wonder why we have a system that's in crisis. It means that in the absence of federal leadership, that private organizations are stepping up to the plate. Sandy Hook Promise, the group of parents of many of those children who are killed, has taken up a cause called No One Eats Alone. It's a wonderful, wonderful cause in which students in high school and middle school and elementary school cafeterias are asked to seek out that one or two children that you know often eat alone, who are socially isolated at school, and to reach out and do little small things like sitting with them during lunch to remove some sense of social isolation that comes often with children who bring mental illness or learning disabilities to school. Now, that effort is admirable, and it will make a difference. But it speaks to the fact that those groups have to step in and do things like the No One Eats Alone campaign, because Congress isn't stepping up to the plate and doing anything about these numbers: 31,000 a year, 2,600 a month, 86 a day. Now, you know what my feelings are on this. I don't think it's just about mental health programming and funding. I also think it's ridiculous that 90% of Americans think that you should have to go through a background check in order to buy a gun, and yet we still won't move forward with expanded background checks, that the majority of Americans think that dangerous assault weapons should be for the police and for our military, not be able to get into the hands of young troubled men like Adam Lanza to be used in mass murder. But in the absence over the next 2 years of our ability to come to an agreement on changing our gun laws so that they reflect where the vast majority of the American public are, let's at least take on the mental health crisis in this country. So let's at least decide that we're going to plus up resources for community mental health providers, that we're going to rebuild inpatient capacity, that we're going to recognize that as angry as we are at people like Ismail Brinsley, of young men like Adam Lanza, that there's a story there of neglect, that if we address, we can lower these numbers even without changes over the next 2 years in our, I would argue, very backwards national background checks laws. So, Madam President, I thank you for listening, and for some of my colleagues for being on the floor today. I know we have a number of people who want to speak, but I'm going to continue to come down to the floor so that my colleagues can hear the stories of people like Officer Ramos, of people like Officer Liu, of stories of heroes like Dr. Michael Davidson, so that maybe the voices of these victims can prompt us to action. I yield the floor.